This wasn't just a war fought in trenches or across muddy battlefields. It wasn't only bayonets, artillery, or barbed wire. World War I was also a financial war, a silent conflict waged in gold reserves, in bond markets, in central banks, and inside the offices of men who never saw the front lines, the soldiers paid with blood. But the governments and bankers, they balanced ledgers, and what they did during those years didn't just decide who won or lost. It reshaped the entire global financial system. The same system that still defines your life today. If you think war is only about armies and politics, think again. The First World War proved that money itself could be weaponized, and that once unleashed, financial warfare could outlast any battlefield victory. By 1914, Europe was already a powder keg. National rivalries, colonial ambitions, and mutual paranoia had turned the continent into a chessboard of fear. But beneath all the speeches about honor and empire, there was a quieter reality. Wars of that scale could only be fought with enormous sums of money. Here's the truth. When leaders chose war, they also chose debt. Every empire that marched its troops forward was also pushing its citizens into generations of economic burden. At first, most governments believed the war would be short. Over by Christmas, they said. They imagined they could pay for it the old-fashioned way, with gold, limited borrowing, and patriotic donations. But within weeks, that illusion vanished. The war devoured money faster than any economy could handle. In the summer of 1914, Europe's financial system still rested on the gold standard. Paper money could be exchanged for actual gold, a promise that kept public trust alive, but also tied governments' hands. Gold reserves were limited. You couldn't just print endlessly without destroying credibility. Britain, France, and Germany all had respectable reserves, but the costs of modern war were astronomical. Germany was spending over 10 million marks per day by late 1914. Britain, over 2 million pounds daily. The math was brutal. The gold would not last. So one by one, governments suspended the rules. They abandoned gold, admitting quietly that money was now backed only by faith in the state. That decision changed the world. For the first time, major economies detached money from physical value. Money became a promise, and promises can always be stretched. Once governments tasted that freedom, they never went back. Germany, cut off from global credit and blockaded by the British Navy, had only one choice: borrow from its own citizens. The government launched massive war loan campaigns, flooding cities with propaganda. Posters called on families to invest their savings in the fatherland. Millions obeyed, believing they'd be repaid after victory. Germany raised more than 100 billion marks through these bonds. When defeat came, those papers became worthless. Millions of Germans lost everything, and that bitterness would later fuel extremism. Britain's position was different. London was still the world's financial capital, and the pound was trusted worldwide. At first, Britain relied on short-term loans and patriotic fundraising, but soon it tapped into global credit, mainly from the United States. America was officially neutral, but its bankers saw opportunity. J.P. Morgan and Company became the financial lifeline of Britain and France, arranging massive loans and handling purchases of food, weapons, and materials. By the time the U.S. entered the war in 1917, Wall Street had already bankrolled much of the Allied effort. This wasn't charity. It was business. And it turned the United States into the new center of global finance. That's how the American century began, not in the trenches, but in the balance sheets. France, already strained by years of military buildup, leaned heavily on loans both at home and abroad. French citizens, famous for their thrift, were urged to buy government bonds, while much of the deeper financing again came from America. After the war, these debts became a political and economic weight that shaped decades of instability. Russia's experience was even worse. Its empire was huge, but underdeveloped, its financial system fragile. It borrowed heavily from its allies, especially France, but inflation soon exploded. By 1917, the Russian ruble had collapsed. The economy fell apart. And with it, the monarchy. The revolution wasn't just about politics or ideology, it was also about financial collapse. By 1918, the numbers were staggering. The Allies had spent over $140 billion. The Central Powers around $60 billion. These sums dwarfed anything the world had seen. The gold standard was shattered, inflation raged, ordinary workers and savers suffered. Germany's middle class watched their savings evaporate in hyperinflation. A loaf of bread cost billions of marks. The rich protected themselves through foreign assets and insider information. Once again, the pattern was clear. In a financial war, the small saver bleeds first. World War I taught governments something they never forgot. You can fund the impossible by detaching money from reality. You can suspend gold, print endlessly, issue bonds, and borrow from the future, then patch the damage later with propaganda. Sound familiar? That same playbook reappeared in the Great Depression in 2008, and even today. When leaders say, "This is temporary," or "the fundamentals are sound," remember 1914. They said the same thing then, right before currencies collapsed. When the war ended, the world was financially unrecognizable. The U.S. had become the largest creditor and gold holder. Europe, once the heart of global finance, was drowning in debt. Britain owed the U.S. $4 billion. France owed $3 billion. And smaller nations were tangled in debts they could never repay. Wall Street, not London, now ruled global finance. The end of fighting didn't mean peace. It only began a new financial war. Over repayment. Britain and France, desperate to honor their bonds, demanded reparations from Germany. The Treaty of Versailles set the bill at 132 billion gold marks, an impossible sum. Germany tried to pay, printing more money, exporting goods, begging for extensions. The result was economic chaos. By 1923, hyperinflation had destroyed what little faith remained in the system. And that collapse paved the way for extremism. Britain's own attempt to restore its financial prestige by returning to the gold standard in 1925 backfired. The pound was pegged too high, the economy too weak. The result, deflation, unemployment, and despair. Meanwhile, the U.S. was flooded with gold and credit, and began lending back to Europe. Germany borrowed from America to pay Britain and France, who then used that money to pay America back. It looked stable. It wasn't. When the Great Depression hit, the whole structure collapsed. The world had never been more connected, or more fragile. World War I was not just a military disaster. It was an economic turning point. The moment governments learned how to manipulate money at scale and convince citizens it was necessary. It proved that propaganda could turn debt into patriotism, and that those who controlled finance could win wars without firing a shot. Money and power became inseparable, and the world has lived under that reality ever since. So, when central banks today promise that inflation is temporary, when governments raise debt ceilings again and again, when new money appears at the push of a button, remember 1914. The gold standard wasn't abandoned by accident. It was abandoned because it limited power. And once that limit was gone, the temptation to print, to borrow, to manipulate became permanent. Every modern crisis, from the stagflation of the 1970s to the 2008 crash, still echoes that decision. The victims are always the same: ordinary people, small investors, savers, workers, those who believe the system will protect them. The hidden financial war of World War I isn't ancient history. It's the foundation of our world. Because once money becomes a story instead of a standard, it becomes a tool of control. Governments will always find ways to fund wars, bailouts, and crises, and they'll always make you pay for it. Real wealth isn't in numbers or promises. It's in knowledge, awareness, and the ability to see through illusion. That's the only true financial freedom history allows. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes. The financial playbook, written in 1914, is still being used, only with new names and new excuses. Those in power always protect themselves. Those without understanding pay the price. So remember, money is only as real as the trust behind it, and trust can be broken faster than gold can melt. If this gave you a new way to see the past and the present, subscribe to Financial Empire. History has the answers. We'll show you where to look.